Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. We got a crime story for you today, but one with some incredibly interesting twists and turns. Now, on the one hand, it's kind of your classic bank robbery story, but as you're going to hear, this heist, which happened at the turn of the last century, was anything but normal. And here to tell us this great story is Rhonda Ferristall. She's the curator of the Deep River Historical Society, and it was in Deep River where this crime occurred. Rhonda's going to be along in just a moment to fill in all the details. This week's trivia question: it was loud, scary, came on a pitch-black night in the 1740s in rural eastern Connecticut, with some thinking it was the Judgment Day itself. What was it? Well, stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know what we're talking about next week. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. Well, this is a story about a bank robbery, and it occurred way back in 1899. Of course, back then, no surveillance cameras, no alarm bells. If somebody opened a locked door, it was definitely a different era. And the scene, well, it was the town of Deep River, which was a completely different town back then than it is today. Today, you go to Deep River, it's a beautiful town on the banks of the Connecticut River, but you might even call it a little bit sleepy. Not too much happens there now. But back in 1899, as you're going to hear, it was an extremely happening place. Now, the name Deep River, and I must admit I thought this was the case, does not refer to the Connecticut River. There's another river in town that is its namesake, and you'll hear a little bit about that too. Back when this crime occurred, there was still kind of a hint of the wild, wild west in the air, as you're going to hear. But really the most amazing part is that the headstone on the grave of the deceased bank robber, 125 years after the fact, still reads just XYZ. Because we're not 100% sure just who he was. We get the rest of the story from our guest, Rhonda Ferristall. She is the curator of the Deep River Historical Society. Rhonda, let's start off. We're obviously going to be talking about a bank robbery and all the aspects around it. I want to get right to the point of why the Deep River Savings Bank. I mean, if you could explain to people the real underlying economic prosperity that was occurring in Deep River and Ivoryton back in the late 1800s that led to the wealth being accumulated at this bank, that would be a great starting point.
Deep River, as we know it today, is a sleepy little community. But in 1899, this was the height of the Industrial Revolution. We had this 6-mile river running through town called the Deep River. And there were probably 10 to 12 factories that were taking their power from this little 6-mile stream. It was always shallow. So, the Deep is kind of an odd name for it, but it brought prosperity here. We were no longer just an agricultural society. We were making all kinds of products that were being shipped around the world. One of the biggest ones was the ivory industry. And we were making piano keyboards, not pianos, just the piano keyboards, and then later the internal pieces of this. But we never really made a full piano. But in 1899, we had 2 banks that were on Main Street side by side, and each one of them had more than $1 million in assets, which made them a prime target for people looking to gain a little money. There's no real police force that was here at the time. The bank watchman had to call the guy at the hotel, the livery stable, to get some help because there was no established police force here. So why not? got more than $1 million here. It was worth the risk.
One of the things that absolutely amazes me about this bank robbery is that everybody knew it was going to happen. The American Banking Association sent 2 letters, and the first one said there was a group hanging out in New York State that was robbing banks. You should be aware of this. And the second one specifically mentioned the Deep River Savings Bank and said it's going to be robbed. Tell us what we know about those 2 letters.
They had some people that were out in the community that were tracking these bandits through New York State, and they had robbed a number of banks. And how they got Deep River's name, I'm not really sure. But yes, they did specifically say your bank was on the list that they found of potential banks that were going to be robbed. And the very Victorian melodrama here was the quote from the letter that said that the bank robbers would come when the moon has waned and the nights grow darker.
And we will get into that prediction a little bit later. But right now, I want to talk about Harry Cap Tyler. Now, this guy is going to play a prominent role in this story in just a second. Tell us about Harry Tyler and what he had done a couple of years before this in the, I guess, mid-1890s.
Harry Tyler was 31 years of age in 1899. He was single. He was a volunteer fireman, and he had his own little boat down at the Deep River Landing, and he was delivering packages or goods. You know, if you needed something shipped to Hartford or something like that, he'd take that job on and deliver your package for you. And that's how he got the title Captain, Cap Tyler. You know, he had this eye on a young woman named Grace Ingram, and he was thinking about getting married. And when the bank approached him about being a night watchman, he thought, it's February. It's cold. Why not work at the bank at night where it's warm and make a little bit of extra money? And the bank chose him because he was already a hero. 2 years prior to this, Mr. Lamadou had a dry goods store in town. He was losing product at night, couldn't figure out why and where his merchandise was going. And so they hired Harry to be the night watchman at the store. And after a few nights, he caught the man red-handed without firing a shot. And the man went to jail and everything was great. So he was already labeled a hero. So it was kind of a no-brainer to hire Harry to watch the bank.
Now, Tyler must have known that there was at least a risk of something happening because he had with him a Winchester rifle on the night of December 13th, 1899. Would you pick up the story? What happened that night?
First of all, the bank president went all the way down to New Haven to purchase the gun for Harry. The only time he had ever fired it was at target practice in the backyard. But this was a long story. You know, they hired him in February and nothing happened. Night after night, he was there and nothing happened. And the moon changed and whatever, and nothing happened. And the bank officials were getting a little antsy about this and thought, we're wasting our money here. Nothing's going to happen. And they were talking about letting him go until the community rose up and said, we want Harry here. And from pressure from the community, they asked Harry to come back to work at night. But months later, I mean, from February all the way to December 13th was a night like every other one. He went to work, and you have to know the old bank, the 1899 bank, is a brick square. And the front door had a glass panel in it so you could see out the front. The two sides, the south and north side, each had a window in it, and then the back. So he could stay in the director's office and really look at all four sides of the building at once. They left a small light burning for him, more like a little nightlight kind of deal. So he wasn't in total darkness. He made friends with the dog that lived next door, William Stevens's dog, because he would be out at night. And every time that the dog barked, Harry knew to look around and check out his surroundings. And most of the time it was a squirrel or some kind of silly thing running around. But on this one particular night, when Harry looked out, he saw four men walking in a single line in what they called lockstep. So it sounded like only one set of footprints. His first thought was that these were some of the guys from the Young Men's Society that were just out to prank him a little bit and play a trick on him. Then he saw them come up to the front of the bank, and then they surrounded the bank. He saw one at every window and thought, this is not right. So he got ready. On the north window, he heard the sound of the window being pried open. And after the fact, they found chisels in the window at where they had pried it up. And that's what he had heard first. As he looked out the window, he saw the man with the chisels, and behind them, that man's hand with a revolver. So he knew that they were armed. So he fired through the window, catching our bank robber in the face, on the right side of his face. So it went kind of through his eye and off the side. I mean, this is a double-barreled riot shotgun. So it did a lot of damage to this man's face. And then he ducked because he figured that there's three other guys with guns out there. And he waited, and he waited, and he waited, and not a sound. Finally, after about 10 or 15 minutes, he got up and used the telephone. The only one he could rouse was William Mitchell over at the hotel. And he said, it told him what happened. He goes, I need help. You need to bring help. So Mr. Mitchell went and got the bank president, and they all came. It was about a half an hour before people actually arrived. And they were afraid to kind of approach it because all of these men with guns are running around, what would happen. But they never saw a soul. They never heard any movement, nothing. And so they went to help Harry, and they found the bandit laying on the ground, probably died instantly from the gunshot wound. But he had a loaded revolver with him. He had drills so that he was going to blow up the safe. There was dynamite in his pockets, all the things that he would need to open the safe, but no identification.
Now, when they finally recover this body and take him to the funeral home, the coroner has to make a determination of cause of death. And I guess that Tyler was actually under suspicion at first of, was this self-defense or had he murdered somebody?
Yes, they called it inquest. And they had a panel of a half a dozen townspeople. There was not too many people who could give testimony. They called the bank president in, who talked about the letters and the threats to the bank. But who else were they going to call? Harry, took the stand and told his story. And the coroner decided that this was Tyler doing his job.
Now, the coroner had to try and figure out, along with the police, as much information about this individual as they could. The body was not claimed. The undertaker didn't know who it was. What steps did they take to try and figure out, since he didn't have any ID on him and nobody seemed to know who he was, what steps did they take to try to identify him?
There was a lot of clues, but they kind of all led to a dead end. First of all, the coroner said that he was a man, when he looked at his hands, that worked with oil or greasy substances. And one of the thoughts was that he was P.E. King, who was a brakeman on the Albany and Boston Railroad. And the coroner said that the condition of the hands would be somebody who would have worked in that type of a profession. So, maybe this is the guy. But his shirt had a laundry sticker in it that called it Rogers. Now, who is Rogers? They looked all over, they went to the laundry. No one could identify this Rogers. And he was well nourished. He was not somebody who was starving or emaciated. He was in good physical condition, but he only had $1.20 in his pocket. And that probably would have gone further than $1.20 would today, but still, it wasn't a lot of money. So who was this man? He did have a schedule for the train from Springfield to Hartford. So they looked in Springfield for any relatives and turned up nothing. They went all the way to Albany to talk to Mr. Fairley, who was a bartender at this place that was known to take care of crooks. And he said that, yes, he knew this P.E. King and that he worked on the railroad, but he hadn't seen him for 6 months or so. And they showed him pictures, and he totally denied that these photos were of P.E. King. So was he lying to protect him? We don't know.
Speaking of photos, didn't the coroner and or the police take photos to circulate these in what was then the media?
Oh, yes, they did. They published his picture in every newspaper that would carry it, from Boston to New York and as far south as Washington, D.C. They brought in the Pinkertons from New York, who came to look at the body, and they said, he's not somebody we're looking for, and walked away.
Officials got finally a letter, and I always smile when I read this, that it was written in what was determined to be women's handwriting. Certainly, if they looked at mine, they would say no woman had ever written what I wrote. But the bank, I guess, got this letter, and it was supposedly requesting a specific grave marker. And what do we know about that?
Not much more. That the letter came to the bank. They felt it was written in by a woman requesting that they bury him under the marker XYZ. And Harry felt bad about the whole situation. And Harry took it on, and he went out and he made a wooden marker and carved the letters XYZ. And when they finally brought him to a pauper's grave at Fountain Hill Cemetery, he placed the marker over the grave. It is probably the most frequently visited grave in the entire cemetery. Today, there's more than 7,000 souls buried at Fountain Hill Cemetery, but certainly he is the one that is most asked about. And when you visit, there's coins there, there's plastic flowers. Somebody left a shotgun shell one day.
Now, for 40 years, there was a woman, allegedly, who came every December, which was, of course, the anniversary month of his death, to leave a flower. Tell us what we know about this so-called Lady in Black.
There are people that say that she never existed, but there's a lot more who say that they saw her, that she would come on the train, walk up the back of the cemetery, and leave flowers on his grave, and that she would just kind of melt away and go back on the train until the following year. Her last sighting was in 1947.
Nobody actually ever went up to her and said, "Who are you and where are you from?" Did they?
Oh, no, absolutely not. And I was told that they didn't do it because they didn't want to intrude on her grief.
Now, let's talk about Tyler one more time, because after this incident, he used to then be known as the Lollipop Man. Tell us about that stage of his life.
So that's his retirement. He was very busy all of his life. He went back to work at the bank for a number of years, but in his retirement, for exercise every day, he walked along Main Street talking with his friends and had a nice little walk. The kids in town would refer to him as the Lollipop Man. He liked to carry a basket, and in the basket was a number of lollipops that he would hand out to the children. It was a number of years later, for me, several years ago, that I ran into Cap Tyler's grandson, who told me the story that even in his retirement, he continued to get death threats. And he always carried a loaded revolver with him. And in the basket underneath those lollipops was his gun.
Now, 3 months after this bank robbery, nobody knows who this guy is. A definitive article, which I think you have just really recently uncovered from February of 1900, pinpoints who they think this XYZ guy was.
Yeah, the article says the burglar identified. And it talks about the number of aliases that XYZ used during his lifetime. And maybe that's why the letter came saying, call him XYZ, because he didn't really have just one name. Maybe Frank Howard, maybe Frank Ellis, maybe Tom Ellis, maybe Tom Howard, maybe P.E. King. The list goes on and on. There were reports that maybe he was involved in this bank robbery in Michigan, where a bank guard was killed. Maybe he was the guy from Albany, New York. If it was, he was a known desperate criminal with a long, long record, thefts from all over the country.
And I understand that there's at least some suspicion of the timing surrounding this bank heist because it was coming up on the holiday season.
Yeah, were they that desperate? Maybe you don't go to a bank robbery with all your money in your pocket, but it looked like he was pretty desperate. It's a holiday season. You've got $1 million in that bank. That would go a long way to making a nice holiday, or maybe retirement for him. Who knows? And of course, the one really neat twist in all of this is that after the fact, these chisels that they were using to open the bank window turned out to be Harry Tyler's. So Harry had a little shop down by the Deep River Landing where he kept his boat, and he had a little room where he kept his woodworking tools so that he could work on his boat. And these chisels were brand new. He had just purchased them. And it looks like these 4 men got off the train, probably early on, and needed a place to hide out. And they actually picked the shed where Harry was kept his tools. And they said, hey, these will be a nice asset for us. And maybe that's why the coroner had to look at Harry. And I mean, you can't be on both sides of the window at the same time, but were they friends? Were they somebody he knew? But they cleared him fully.
Now, what about those 3 guys who accompanied the XYZ bandit? Well, they managed to flee and they were never caught. Now, 2 men were spotted early the next morning speeding through Madison, Connecticut in a horse and wagon. And witnesses said that the mouth of the horse looked frothy, as if it had been running for too long. Now, at the same time, another man going the opposite direction in Winstead suddenly appeared at a farm looking for a day's worth of chores and a meal, and shortly after that, he moved on. Were those the 3? Well, we're simply never going to know for sure. Wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. We do have one loose end to wrap up about this story. You may recall the second letter to the bank said the impending robbery would happen on a moonless night. But the evening that the Deep River Bank was robbed, it was nearly a full moon, and that gave Harry Cap Tyler all the help he needed to see the robber at the window. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Rhonda Ferristall. She's the curator of the Deep River Historical Society. Well, the answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, it was loud, scary, came on a pitch-black night in the 1740s in rural eastern Connecticut, some thinking it was the Judgment Day itself. What was it? Well, I'm going to break with my own rules a little bit. I'm not going to really tell you the answer because that would spoil the episode for next week, and I want to keep you in a little bit of suspense. So next week on Amazing Tales CT, suffice it to say, you're going to find it as amusing as most people did to learn about the incredibly loud noise that scared an entire village in the colonial era, including battle-hardened veterans. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.